We're going to segue straight away into the next session. Rajan mentioned the whole America-China trade war as being one of the big things to watch out for. It's fascinating in a world where flamboyant men are trying to pull it down. You need incisive, quiet, sharp intellects that keep it going. Shiv Shankar Menon is certainly one of those sharp intellects that keep it going. He has been the Foreign Secretary of India. He's been a former National Security Advisor. He's been India's man in Israel, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and did I say Pakistan? I did, yes. So he's really been in every hotspot that India engages with. He's written a book called Choices, which, as we said, will be available for signing afterwards, which looks at 5 pivotal foreign policy decisions that India made, including why we didn't go in for overt military action after 26/11. He's been part of the nuclear deals. He's really been, as I said, in the cockpit of some of the most epochal policy decisions that India makes in its relationship with the world. So it's very, very wonderful to have him here for a masterclass on the madness of geopolitics around us. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Shiv Shankar Menon. So, Shankar, I gave Rajan an easy start to describe what happiness is.
And he gave me all the questions, I noticed.
Yes. But let me drop you into the hottest part of it, which is, as National Security Advisor, you know how important, and we know how important the CBI as an institution is. In your time, it was called a caged parrot. Mm-hmm. Today, it's called a dead parrot, how do you read the current face-off in the CBI? How do you read the government's role in it? And when you look back, very honestly today, Shankar, that's the pleasure of having you here in a community like this, is that, has the CBI ever really been an independent institution?
I think it has been an independent institution. What's happening now is tragic. Because frankly, it's an institution that we need. You can't do without an independent investigative body, which is why whenever there was trouble in the States or politically sensitive cases, even opposition chief ministers and so on would ask for the CBI to do their work. So it's something we need. It's not something we can just say we can do without this at all. What's happening now is tragic, and I think it's proof that no institution can survive bad people. I think it just shows how important it is that you choose the right people in these jobs. And especially, that I think it's very important that you choose the right people especially for these kinds of jobs, jobs of trust, and which are highly sensitive. I mean, frankly, what's happening in the CBI is it's a disgrace. And the trouble is it does it to an institution which we need. It's not just, any institution. And an institution which also, if it's misused, has terrible consequences.
But Shankar, in all fairness, the CBI has had actually very diluted credibility. It's always been seen as an instrument of government, and which is why I said even under your regime, it was seen as a caged parrot, Today, when it's a dead parrot, or it's really a dying parrot where states are saying we no longer want the CBI to come in?
That's a matter of opinion. I think the problem is you also don't want an institution like that to be too powerful. You do want a parrot, you want a parrot to be caged. I mean, otherwise,
that's an interesting perspective.
No, and frankly, that's what it's built for. It's built to do a certain job, but not to step outside those bounds. That's why you have laws. And that's why you have restraints and checks and balances on these institutions. You don't want to give any one of them absolute power in a democracy. So, therefore, frankly, for me, it's not is it caged? Does it have unlimited power? I think that's dangerous in a society like ours, where frankly, if you look around us, everybody is a minority one way or the other, by language, by religion, by caste, by region, you break us down. So
as Jack Dorsey just found out, Brahmins feel they are a minority.
They are a minority, and they are. In terms of numbers, they are. So the fact is we are therefore a democracy, because the democracy is the only way all of us feel we have a say in our own future. We make alliances with other groups, and these shift, so our coalitions shift. We have all these Gathbandhans, as you call them, but they shift this is how we work. That's why we're a democracy. So, but you have to have checks and balances and restraints on these institutions. But as I come back to my original point, for me, the critical part is you need good people to run them. And that's the bit where I think that where we've taken our eye off the ball over time. In the quest, how do I put this? By trying to be just, that we lay down all these criteria, you tick all these boxes, we forgot that we have to actually look at the quality of the people and their moral fiber, their character. There are other things involved also.
So, Shankar, could you just
Speak into it. Okay.
Yes. There was always this articulation problem in your government. You mustn't perpetuate it. Speak loudly and clearly,
I
Shankar.
thought I talked too much.
Don't be the security advisor of the absent Mon Prime Minister. But so just before we move away, what is your solution about how this particular terrible imbroglio in the CBI should be handled?
Well, I think now it's in the courts. And, I think presumably the Supreme Court will lay down a set of guidelines and show us a way forward. And I assume that they're asking people for advice and, they have friends of the court. I presume that's the only way forward now that we've come to this pass.
So, everyone in India has this wonderful fallback and refuge to say now it's in the courts.
No, well,
but in this year,
this one is,
but everything is. Even Ayodhya issue is, many
things
issues
that shouldn't be there are there, cricket, all kinds of things.
Yes, so I'm going to come to the ones that shouldn't be there. But the question I was going to ask you is that this year we even saw the courts come under tremendous scrutiny, over last year and this year when the judges spoke out. Again, there was a lot of criticism about how, and in fact, even someone like the lawyer Arya Sundaram, who's seen as fairly close to this regime, said that this government perhaps has tried to intrude into the judiciary more than any other previous government, barring Mrs. Gandhi. But the question we put to them was that if it is an issue of good people, then the crisis in the judiciary also comes out of those that the UPA regime had appointed, So again, to come back to the question, Shankar, about how concerned are you about the state of the Indian judiciary? All the noise seems to have died down. Is that institution robust? Do you feel that it's healthy? And what do you think about the quality of people who are there now?
Quality of people is something that you can't solve overnight. That comes and goes, and it goes up or down depending. Ultimately, if you look at the institution, judiciary, it's still a remarkable institution. It's an institution that most people still have faith in. Why do people go to the courts when they have trouble? Why are all our big issues, including things like air pollution and so on, we go straight to the courts? I think that reflects the kind of faith people have in the courts and the expectations they have. And it's an interesting thing about expectations. If you have very high expectations of an institution or a person, they tend to try and live up to it. It becomes much harder for them not to. So I am an optimist. My simple answer to you would be yes. I think they're a great institution. Any judicial system will be criticized in the din of politics. This is normal. But I think, if you look at the Indian record, I think it's really quite good.
It's interesting you mentioned this, and it's a wonderful, yeah, sure. It's a wonderful point to keep in mind that when you expect high of somebody that they normally live, or at least attempt to live up to that, because there was a lot of that when Mr. Urjit Patel was made governor of RBI just after demonetization. There was a sense that he would be a, kind of appendage to government, but he has occupied that seat and made the seat speak, so it's a...
Well, they used to say of Pakistan chiefs of army staff that the seat makes the man. And many of those who I think were appointed...
Shankar, in this day and age, you have to say seat makes the man and the woman.
And the woman, the person, maybe. But, many of those who were appointed thinking that they would be subservient were the ones who actually then went on and to assert their authority. So, this is true, I think, in most institutions. And so for me, it's not really, people say, oh, things have all gone to pot, it's impossible and so on. I think these things can be fixed. But I think we need to apply our mind to how to fix these things.
So if you have time, I'm going to come back to how to fix it. But, it was very interesting when you mentioned, in your book, you look at why India opted not to have a military reaction to 26/11, which was a huge provocation. This government, on the contrary, did do that surgical strike and made a very large noise about it. So looking at it purely from a perspective of foreign policy, public articulation of a country's intention, which do you think was the better route, and how do you see that whole surgical strike noise that happened?
Well, it's not either or. I mean, I say in the book itself that if this ever happens again, the government won't react the same way. In fact, it'll be impossible for any Indian government to react the same way. And I also say in the book that when 26/11 happened, my personal reaction was we should do something overtly military and respond. It would have been emotionally satisfying. But now, in retrospect, and I argue it in the book, so please buy it, I argue in the book why I think actually what we did was the right thing for that time and place. But that I don't think that's necessarily true at all times, at all places, because if that were to happen again, it means that deterrence has broken down, in which case you need to do something to restore deterrence and to bring peace. Which, if you look at what we did after 26/11, and you look at the record after that, things were much quieter for a while. Now, again, all the indices are up, whether it's infiltration, whether it's terrorist incidents on our side, whether it's firing on the line, the breakdown of the ceasefire, etc. All that has gone up again. We're in a different situation. You'll have to look at it and find different ways of dealing with it.
So, it's, when you say that, yes, we will have to look at deterrence in the kind of matrix of the world that we live in, do you genuinely think that it is possible to have overt military action against Pakistan without absolute disaster hitting pretty much the entire, I mean, definitely the subcontinent, not to mention the world? Is that really a possibility?
Well, there are all kinds of things that can be done. I mean, there's a whole range of, the spectrum of conflict doesn't mean that the moment you start something, it has to be everything. But there's a risk, there's always a risk, and that's precisely what has kept the peace between nuclear powers in the past and has kept it right through. Why was the Cold War peaceful? Why did it stay cold? Because of nuclear deterrence. And that's also the reason why today nobody would expect the great powers or the nuclear weapon states to end up in a war directly. Because why should you run that risk? And the taboo against use of nuclear weapons is very strong. So it's, for me, that doesn't prevent either low-level asymmetric conflict, which you can see terrorism going on against us, even though we both have nuclear weapons. And you can see other forms of violence. And today, unfortunately, you have whole new domains have opened up. Cyber, for instance. It's another whole domain of a form of warfare, which, is very hard to control. And so it's not necessary that each thing is linked to the next, and that there are various options available, and I'm sure people who are responsible, who will know what capabilities are, will decide, depending on it.
So, one of the, apart from demonetization and GST and the bankruptcy law, as Rajan mentioned, one of the other really sort of very visible proactive stances that Mr. Modi's taken has been in the foreign policy zone. He's really gone all over the world. I can't resist the joke of hugging a lot of leaders, but he's definitely made a lot of overtures in many countries. How would you sort of pick out amongst those some of the most crucial interventions that Mr. Modi's made, which has changed the direction of, say, what earlier governments have done? And most recently now, when he spoke about the Kartarpur Bridge in terms of the Berlin Wall collapsing, how do you read that particular utterance?
Maybe I'm getting old, But for me, I see much more continuity in foreign policy. Every government claims to be new, claims to be different, says we're the best, we're doing things that nobody's done before, when actually people have been doing exactly the same before. I have a different problem. My problem is the world has changed tremendously in the last 5 years. And to do the same thing in the expectation of the same results or good results, for me, that's not very smart. That's, part of Einstein's definition of madness. It's so I think that's our problem. We haven't adapted fast enough to the changing world. Rajan just mentioned about China-US. I think there's a fundamental phase shift there. It's structural now, and the shift towards contention in their relationship. They'll still cooperate. I mean, they're still economically linked, and they'll do deals, but they'll be like the deal with Kim Jong-un. Nothing will change, but you'll claim that you've
You're
done
in
big
love.
deals. But basically, contention is now driving that relationship. So it's changed fundamentally. You need to adjust to that because it's going to be a very different environment that you work in. And so for me, that's the problem today. That I'm not sure, we've got so used to doing certain things. And basically, when was the last big change in Indian foreign policy? Was after 91. And that was done by a minority government, which served its full term. It didn't even have a majority in parliament. And look what they did. They reformed the economy, they opened up the economy, they changed foreign policy fundamentally. They kept saying we're doing what Nehru did, but did exactly the opposite. And it was remarkable what they actually achieved. And really, it's that line which has been going on. But I think it's time now to do another, we need to look around the world, see how it's changed. And it's changed in many fundamental ways. So the balance of power has shifted.
So, Shankar, that's a very crucial point you made. So if we zero in on just that, now that the whole America-China equation is changing, what role should India be gearing up for? Even if it's not, what should it be muscling up for? We have contentious issues with China pretty much on all counts, with what they're doing in Pakistan, the South China Sea. We're seeing Maldives and Sri Lanka really feeling the pain of becoming protectorate states, So what should India be doing? What should it be worrying about? And what is it not doing?
Well, let's start with, Maldives, Sri Lanka owe China a lot of money. Is that a problem for the creditor or the debtor?
For the debtor more than the creditor?
I don't think so. No. If you owe the bank enough money, you own the bank. There's, honestly, I mean, it's the bank that has to get the money from you. And
you both are giving us wonderful takeaways today. The idea of happiness and this idea of owning banks.
Well, I'm a happy Airtel customer, by the way. I pay my bills. No, but seriously, I don't think we should insult Sri Lanka and the Maldives by saying, oh, they're hopeless people, they've gotten to debt, they don't know what to do. They have a sense of pride, they have a sense of independence. They will do what they need to in order to maintain that. And if China converts Hambantota into a long 99-year lease, it was a dud before, now it's a dud which they have a lease on. But it doesn't solve the problem. So I think we should stop worrying about this is normal. I've heard this about Sri Lanka. In 1967, Sri Lanka started exchanging rubber for rice with China. And you should have seen the Indian media. Oh, the Chinese are coming, they're taking over South Asia. Skies were about to fall. So what? Nothing happened. So frankly, I'm not sure that we should look at the world purely in this negative zero-sum way. If there is China-US contention, it actually opens space for you in two ways. And you've seen it already. China, because she has to concentrate on what she's doing with the US, is today, in a sense, quieter and has been much more positive in her relationship with us, with Japan. Abe just visited, with the other neighbors, because she'll concentrate on what's important to her. Both China and the US will come to you. Not either they'll want you as an ally, or they will at least want to prevent you from being an ally of their enemy. So it actually opens up a certain geopolitical space, but it will also have all kinds of other consequences for you economically, which are not necessarily good, as Rajan said. You might immediately manage to step in and sell some soybeans where the US was selling it before and so on. But that's short-term tactical. You will be collateral damage to the various tariff measures and the various sanctions. And you've seen that happen already with Iran, for instance. Both of them are now becoming more and more exclusionary. You look at the new NAFTA, and it has a clause in there saying the US will review the whole agreement if they sign a free trade agreement with a non-market economy. In other words, if Canada or Mexico does anything with China, they will review it. The Chinese have put into the new South China Sea draft code that they prepared, not yet agreed, that every country will only do exercises in the South China Sea if there is consensus among all the states. In other words, Chinese will have a veto about over who. So each one is now trying to build his own structures and alliances. this requires some finesse to deal with it. It opens space for you, but it's going to be hard choices of how do you do it. Economically, you have to choose whether you're going to engage or not. The Chinese will push RCEP, will try and do the regional economic cooperation and free trade agreement that we've been working on with Japan, China, the whole of ASEAN, and the whole region. You have to choose. It's been postponed by a year, largely because we've only agreed 5 out of 18 chapters. But we will have to decide after the elections, after our elections, whether or not we want to be part of this new economic area which is growing. And the world economy will fragment as each one tries and gathers their own allies and tries to exclude the other. So it's going to be a very different world from what we've got used to, this big globalized world where, you know, capital, at least capital and goods can flow freely, maybe not people and maybe not intellectual property, but, you know, it was an open, globalized world, and we were the biggest, one of the biggest, the second biggest beneficiary of that world for the last 20 years after China. But that world is finished, and that's why I say that we have to actually up our game and change it.
Shankar, when, you know, you really pinpointed it, that this whole protectionist regime completely changes the structure of the world as one has known it. So when you're saying that we would have to make choices, can we get a sneak insight into what is the choice that you would advocate that one makes?
Well, I would say that we have one simple criteria by which we decide what to do. We have only one job in life. We have to transform India, right? There's too much poverty, too many malnutrited children. We have too much to do at home. Everything we do abroad, anything we choose, that has to be the one criteria you apply. So in other words, you cannot then tie your chariot to somebody else's horse. You cannot say, oh, I'll join this alliance. Nobody else is going to solve these problems for you. You will try and work out an enabling environment, a peaceful periphery in South Asia, number one. 2, you will try and see economic advantage, what you can do to actually raise your growth rates. And you are an economy which depends on the rest of the world for fundamental things. I mean, more than 50% of your GDP today is, if you add both merchandise, goods, and services, more than 50% of GDP is actually from outside the world, from the rest of the world. It's actually external. And we don't realize this. We think of ourselves as a huge domestic engine, right? But by 2014, just merchandise trade and goods was 49.3% of GDP. That's almost half. We need energy. We have no energy. We import energy. You need non-ferrous metals. When you look at your economy, you need technology. You need capital as well. You need access to those markets. I mean, you need to be able to you need to earn the money to start to import all this stuff. So frankly, you have no choice. You can't turn your back on the world, but you have to use that for the transformation of India. And for me, that's the one single criteria. Do what you need to do to change India.
So, you know, this is the pleasure
But, you know, I can't resist saying this. Therefore, if you start chasing status, glory, if you want to be loved, if you want the rest of the world to admire you, frankly, you're wasting your time.
I'm glad we had a smooth operator as a security advisor, Shankar. But, you know, it's very interesting hearing you speak, and that's the pleasure of having an expert, which is that hearing you speak, through all his madness, you know, Mr. Trump is really seen by the media and by the average person as the most bewildering political phenomenon of all time. But is he, by sheer madness, actually doing some good in the world? Is he doing good for America? Is some of the, you know, bold moves that he's making opening up the world in ways that it needed to be opened up? How would you read Trump, not through the lens of democratic norms, but through economic and geopolitical norms?
Well, I think Trump represents a shift which has been happening for some time in the US. Many of the things that we accuse Trump of isolationism, of America firstism, of not being willing to go out and run the global system, as it were, provide global public goods, of the retreat from being Globocop, basically, of leading from behind, as all this started not just now, but in Obama's time and earlier, and was partly a reaction to the global war on terror, to the war in Afghanistan, Iraq. If you look at US society, the idea that somehow they were losing jobs because of globalization, they've been losing jobs for 50 years, since the Second World War. But the idea is fairly widely held. It's not just Democrats or Republicans, it's not just Trump. And the idea that, and Trump represents, therefore, for me, something much more structural. So it's not, even if he's a one-term president, I don't see some of these things he started going away very quickly. I don't see that changing. I could be wrong, but that's the way I see it. Some of it is also because the US, since the Second World War, it's had one goal in policy, which is to prevent the emergence of a peer competitor anywhere in the world. True Soviet Union. After that, there was a unipolar moment for a while, at least until the 2008 crisis. They were the only superpower, and they were the hegemon. But after the 2008 crisis, and now at least, it looks as though China could be a peer competitor. She isn't yet. She's nowhere near. I mean, in her own neighborhood, perhaps. In the seas near China, but not outside that. Not in Africa, Latin America, Middle East, wherever else you go. But that, I don't see the US giving that up. That basic fundamental goal of preventing the emergence of a peer competitor. And if that's the case, then many of Trump's policies are not going away either. So I'd rather not pin it to just a personality or, he might have his own ways of doing business, and some of it is quite peculiar, and it's fun, actually, to read those tweets.
Fun.
But, no, to read the tweets and to watch it. You just wish you were on another planet, but that's another problem.
So, Shankar, it's not just Trump. There's the rise of the right, as we say, everywhere across the globe, even down to Brazil now. How do you read that? As I said, when you read it in the media and through the liberal,
Well, in India, it's been a long-term process. In the first and second parliaments, the Communist Party of India was the second largest party in parliament. Today, what are they? They're not even a regional party. And just about in one state, one of the smallest states in India. I mean, the whole center of gravity of politics in India has moved to the right, if you look at it over time. So in our case, actually, it's a long-term secular trend, and it's not something that's just brand new or, oh, shock, I think in the West, in Brazil and so on, it's partly a reaction to this, which we don't have in India, the strange alliance between the left is seen as liberal and globalized, and somehow not national enough. But that's not true in India. Our division between left and right and so on has been quite different. So you have to look at individual causes, I think, in different countries. China's moved to the right as well in terms of, authoritarian control, social credit systems, using digital means to check on everyone and so on. But that's a different right from what it's still a communist party, even though they now jail Marxists for going and inspecting what students are doing. So I think in each case you need to look at how it's happened. In Japan's case, it's a reaction to an abnormal situation, and they're actually becoming a normal state.
So let's look at the two countries that kind of dominate the popular imagination, which is our own country and America. So when you said that this process has been going on for many years in India, what would you see as a couple of the root causes, that have pushed the center to the right? And similarly for America, why would these two sort of bastions of liberal democracy want to move right? What went wrong?
I have no idea about America. I can't answer for that. For India, I don't know. I would assume that it's part of the rise of the middle class. I mean, the middle class has property and other things to defend. They're not going to make a revolution. Not the same way.
But it's not stuck between revolution and,
Well, I mean, that's in India, the left is revolution. The middle class is somewhere in the middle, but moving to the right, the more prosperous they get. Because frankly, I don't believe any of our figures. I think a lot of our, most of our middle class has much more money than they admit to the taxmen or the official people.
So, well then let's come back to one of the other issues that dominates global conversation now, which is the whole idea of migration, you know. It's been a very hot topic in India as well now, especially with Assam and the National Citizen Register. It's such a difficult topic to have a position on. How do you read it, and what do you think is the correct approach?
No, that really worries me. Assam really worries me because the kind of, well, ethnic, religious mix that you have in the Northeast, if you start polarizing it and set fire to it, it's a tinderbox. And that is going to be much harder to handle than anything else that we've handled so far. And we've handled all kinds of extreme, you know, separatist movements, all kinds of movements. And we've done it well because we've had a very flexible democratic framework in which to do it. But I'm not sure that, you know, if we actually, some of the things that we're talking about now on citizenship, on, for the first time ever, sending refugees back, and basically on using religious other lines to try and, well, win elections. I mean, this, to my mind, is truly dangerous. This is a real threat to national security.
But the National Citizen Register is an idea that came up in, correct me if I'm wrong, in a Congress regime. You know, they may be...
You know, this is not about Congress or NDA.
You're just saying it's a dangerous issue.
I'm just saying it's a silly thing for any country, and especially a country like India. I started by saying a country where we're all minorities. This is not the way to go, to divide us further and to start doing lists of who's a citizen, who's not, who's this, who's that. I mean, this is not, I mean, and frankly, and to do it so incompetently, by all accounts, where you've left out people who, you know, by every right can claim to be citizens. I mean, that doesn't make sense.
So, you know, Shankar, that would be one's default position. Sorry, we run out
I'd like to see and hear Zeenat Aman too.
Yes. So, just to wrap that, because I think a lot of people find that hard to understand, because, you know, when that whole demographic profile changing, we are taking the liberal position on it, but a lot of people in Assam, for instance, say you don't know how the whole demographic profile has changed. How does one take that on board, you know?
That's true, and I think, but that's something that has to be worked out politically in Assam itself, rather than adding our own confusions from Delhi. Anyway.
I can see that you're on acceleration because of Zeenat Aman, but since you were the National Security Advisor, under all previous regimes, there have been so much of homegrown sort of terror incidents. Under this regime, there's been relatively less terror incidents. Is the national security infrastructure working better under this regime than under yours?
Actually, the number and the severity of terrorist incidents in India has actually declined now for about 16 years. What has gone up is social violence, violence against a person, things like rape and so on, and communal violence since 2012 has been going up steadily, which reflects, I think, the kind of polarization that we have. And for me, that's the most dangerous threat that we face. Polarization and communal violence. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Shankar.